let's start. Okay, what do you see here? Uh, Basically, I would like to call this as a pattern recognition first, more of deep learning. So, like, let's call the problems that we're handling is pattern recognition. All right. So, right on the left side of the image, I think you can see two concentric circles. Let's say someone comes to you and asks, um, you know, I want to do some data analysis or pattern recognition on data. The first good step is to visualize the data, either the data if it's possible or the characteristics of the data. By the characteristics, I mean the how is the data distributed? Is it the data evenly distributed? Let's say someone has just told they're working on image classification, nuts and bolts, right? So because it's image already and it's high dimensional, you can't really visualize it. But you can still look at the characteristics of the data that you have in hand. For example, do you have equal number of images of nuts and bolts, or do you have an uneven distribution? And are the images that you have captured have good amount of lighting conditions, or are everything is captured in dark conditions like that? All right. So first, we try to visualize the data that we have in hand, and the patterns that we see here have like we can actually figure out what exactly is the pattern. In the rightmost image, you can just see one line across zero, which can easily separate the red class from the blue class here. Similarly, on the left side of the image, we can easily say that okay, these are two concentric circles. If you assume that this data has two classes, you can just draw a circle here to distinguish between class 1 and class 2. Coming to the here, the middle image, the central image, you can say that red class and blue class doesn't have much distinction, but still you can classify. So the black class is properly separated from the rest of the data. This is what we can do in 2D. Let's say we move to 3D. Let's say someone comes to you and say like, okay, I have, I want to classify flowers based on some three dimensions of data. Okay, what are the three dimensions here? The petal length, and sepal width. This image is taken from a standard dataset called Iris. You can refer to that later. All right, and you'll go ahead with, and then plot the data again. Same practice. Here as well, you can just draw a neat plane here. This plane can separate the data into two classes very well. But what if you have four dimensions, right? You can't really have visualizations like this that we have in 2D or 3D. So usually one step of going to it is to understand which dimensions are important and which dimensions we can omit from the analysis. So the person here who tried to do this have have tried to look at the relationship between every two dimensions. See if can uh, have any redundancy so that he can omit his data. So far we are clear, right? But what if we have even more dimensions, like let's say n-dimensional data? Then how do we go about it? Can't visualize the data really, and it's difficult to find out patterns in it. Clear? So there are two ways of handling when we got n-dimensional data. First, we can go with some dimensionality reduction techniques, for example, principal component analysis or linear discriminant analysis. It's called LDA, which will help us to transform an n-dimensional data space to a lower dimensional data space. That lower dimension that we can define for ourselves. You have some data of endpoints, and each of the endpoint is d dimensions, capital D. Okay. Now you want to see whether you can omit some of these dimensions so that you can bring that n cross d matrix into some n cross r, where r is less than the capital D. So how do we do it? Let's say the analogy I can give you here is, let's say you want to make a dish. Let's say you want to make pasta, and you have 10 main ingredients, and you want to the objective of you is to make pasta with less ingredients as possible, but to retain the taste that is original to the dish. All right. So let's assume that you make 10 variants of the pasta. So in each variant, you omit one ingredient. I mean, stop me if you're not able to follow me. I can repeat this or I can change the example. Okay. So here's we are. We have made 10 variants of pasta, where in each variant we omit one ingredient and we taste it. Okay. So in the first, so we have a reference taste and we have taste from each 10 variants. Whichever brings the whichever variant has more difference to the taste. That means the ingredient that is missing in that adds more value the data, right? I mean to the taste. Following me? So that ingredient is important for retaining the original taste. So the idea we are trying to convey is that we bring that dimensions which are really important and we omit which contains less information or less value. How do we do it? Is basically, let's imagine we have already talked that this data is n cross d matrix. From the classes that we have might have taken from linear algebra, we can compute eigenvalues and eigenvectors for a matrix, right? So consider eigenvalues as the taste difference from the analogy that we have. So whichever dimensions or whichever eigenvalues have higher value, those corresponding eigenvectors are important for us. So let's say if you want to keep 10 dimensions from D, we'll pick the first 10 eigenvectors corresponding to the top 10 eigenvalues. And that's how we reduce the dimensions. Ideally, we can pick the principal. So these dimensions that we retain are main important thing in principal component analysis. And yeah, that's one way of doing it. I won't delve much into it because time reason. Another way that we can handle high dimension data without reducing dimensions. Let's say if you did PCA and still you figured out that there are more dimension enough high dimensions that you still can't reduce it to 3D or 2D. You need to still handle the n-dimensional data. So how do we do it? Is still we have some techniques from linear algebra that we can use to perform regression. Let's say you want to do regression, okay, and we have this n-dimensional data, and we assume, let's say if we are lucky, and if our data is linear. By linear, remember this, I mean the relationship between our input data and output labels. If that relationship is linear, then we can actually formulate a problem as like this. The same formulation you might have seen, from our high school math or engineering math is like x equal to b. That's how we formulate it. Just I have changed the variables here. It's like x beta is equals to y. Let's say x is your input data, right? And then y are your labels. And you need to find out beta parameters to fit these two. And if this n is sufficiently greater than p, then you will have a chance of finding a solution for this. If n is less than p, you don't have a chance of finding solution. So, right, there are some techniques from linear algebra like normal equations and all, which will let us you to find a closed form solution. That means you can write the solution in a single equation to find out the beta parameters here, right? So far we have a way to do regression even given an n-dimensional data, not low-dimensional data. But the catch is that the data has to be linear. Okay, but what if your data is non-linear? How do we deal them? Example here, this image we have seen in the first slide. We can easily draw a line and then we can classify it easily. So ideally, we want for class, it's a regression. We already talked like we need to find out a real number. If you want to speak graphically, just try to imagine that we want to fit a line through the points that were given to us, right? And for classification, we want to draw a line or a plane which can easily separate two sets of data. But for here, which is obviously non-linear. How do we can't draw a line, of course, because so, we need to distinguish between red class and blue class, and a single line cannot serve the purpose. And this is not even higher dimension data. It's just like 1D data, right? And still it's non-linear. How do we deal with it? One quick way of dealing with this data is to transform your data to higher dimensions. So as you can see, sync 1D data on its x variable. When we transform it using a polynomial function, here, this is a quadratic equation. Let's say we transform x into x square, you can just see these points convert into this shape. And now it's obvious that now this transformation provides us with an opportunity to just draw a line to do the same thing, the classification. Yeah, this is the thing. So usually transforming our data to higher dimensions provide us the opportunity to draw a line to classify the data that we have. Same thing here. So we have data like this, and we need to draw a circle here, but the classification needs the linear function that we want to get. If we transform this, that phi here is a transformation function. So that's bring us to support vector machines. Again, like I told, I'm just just going very fast. Let's say you have this kind of data and you want to draw a line. That's like we're talking, you need to draw a line to separate them, to classify them. But here's the thing, right? You can draw line in any one of these ways, and all of them will serve a purpose to classify. But which one should I pick is the question. Which one is optimum line for me to classify with better accuracy, and which will be robust to our outliers, noisy data, everything. So support vector machines will tell you that you compute margin for a line that you pick for all of your data. Okay, I'll repeat this. Let's say you draw a line like this, right? And from this class, this is the closest point, and from this class, this is the closest point. You compute margin. The margin means the distance of this point from this line, and distance from this point is this line. Like that, you can actually compute the margin for all the lines that you can draw to classify between these two. So what do you mean by maximum margin here? So we draw a line in such a way that the margins that we compute are as maximum as possible, or we try to maximize the margins that we're going to get, and that line is what our optimal line would be. So these points that we use to compute that maximum margin are called support vectors. Yeah. So in this case, the margin would be maximum, right? The closest point that we use to compute from margins called support vectors here. And support vector machines also relies on the same idea that we transform our data to higher dimensions using some kernels. These kernels are called, the functions which we use are called kernels. And most common kernel that we use is linear or polynomial kernel. That polynomial can be like higher degree, second degree, third degree, like that. And Gaussian RBFs, Gaussian kernels. In this example, actually, in the example here, you can also use Gaussian kernel to transform your data, right? And that would bring these 3 points at the top, the other way around, and still you would be able to classify them properly. And yes, of course, sigmoid, somebody use sigmoid, but how to choose best kernel, the non-linear kernel to transform your data to higher dimensions. So basically, given the input and output relation is non-linear of our data, we better choose some non-linear functions to model the relationship. But how do we pick the best non-linear function to model it? Mostly when people work with support vector machines, they try to experiment with multiple kernels and multiple parameters here. Like if you're going with polynomial, you try with 2, 3, 4. If you're going with Gaussian, you still need to mention some mean and standard deviation of your kernel like that. But how do we choose the best possible kernel? That is where uh, perceptron models or neural networks comes into picture. So here's a gist of it. Neural networks are like in, you might have already seen them. Like you have multiple neurons in each layer, and you have multiple layers like that. So all those have a non-linear activation function at the end of each neuron. So a sequence of these will provide you with the nonlinear transformation that you want from your input to output without experimenting much with what kernel you need to use, because these things learn what is the ideal nonlinear transformation on their own. So that the self-learning with some algorithm that we provide for neural networks makes them as a better alternatives to SVMs. I mean, of course, SVMs have enjoyed wide range of popularity. Even today, some people use SVMs. But what is the thing that makes us move from SVMs to neural networks is the ability of neural networks to learn from the data that you provide. And moreover, there are some evidences that SVM suffer from outliers. Some noisy data comes in SVM, performance falls apart. That's it. So that's where actually I would like to you to focus on. Kernels provide the SVMs actually provide us the idea that we can transform our data into higher dimensions. But neural networks, on the other hand, will allow us to pick some standard nonlinear functions, and it will learn what kind of mapping will be possible within input and output data. I hope most of you, some of you are aware of this. On the left side, this is like a biological neuron, which McCulloch and Pitts got inspired and designed their perceptron model. Basically, imagine that this is one of your neurons in the brain, and these are connected to other neurons. And analogously, let's say you have a neuron here, and then these connections are towards other neurons, artificial neurons, I mean. And each pair of neurons are connected using some weights, W0, W1, W2, and X0, X1, X2 that we see here are the synapses or the outputs that are coming from the previous set of neurons. Let's say if one neuron has to fire, if let's say if one neuron has to respond based on some inputs from previous neurons, this is very simple notion that it just sums up all the inputs that it gets from X0, X1, and X2 neurons based on the weights that it contains, and there'll be some bias for this. If this exceeds some threshold, the output would be fired from this neuron. Pretty simple and pretty straightforward. But slight catch here, that's called F. It's called an activation function. This is how if you connect multiple neurons here. I want you to understand one thing here. So the weight here represents the strength of the connection between two neurons. Let's say W1 is higher, that means these two neurons are connected better than what X0 and the central neuron is connected. This is the similar way happens in our brain as well. So the stronger connections between two neurons represents that it has a higher chance of firing between those two. So yeah, if it's a linear activation function, then the sum need to be just greater than some threshold to be 1, and if it's less than some threshold, it will be 0. But as we have discussed, we need some nonlinear functions to model the relationships, right? These are the standard nonlinear functions that we use mostly in our day-to-day machine learning model building. The first two you'll see are sigmoid and hyperbolic tangent. And the bottom you can see a variance of ReLUs, rectified linear units. I wanted to understand one thing. So how do we choose or how to understand these functions? Let's say the output of your neuron has to be restricted between 0 to 1. And let's say you have some closed range of your labels, then you can go for sigmoid or hyperbolic tangent based on the output, the ranges that you have. Let's say you don't have any range on your output. Let's say you are facing a regression problem where you want to predict somewhere anywhere between 0 to any higher range, then usually you can go for ReLU. And one more thing, my practice, I believe, like if you're facing with any classification problems, you better go with sigmoid. And if you're going with any regression problems, then you can go for ReLU. I mean, this is not a hard and fast rule. It's just one of the heuristics that we follow. Even I have instances where I have used ReLU for classification. But yeah, like I told, you need to see the function definitions. Based on that, you pick your activation function. And yeah, so this is the activation function is one of the building blocks that we use for making deep learning models. The second building block are the hidden layers. Like there's a one theory that says that neural networks are universal function approximators. That means we can model any function almost using neural networks using a single layer. But there is some arguments that we move on to deeper layers. And that's why we call it as a deep learning today. We have more and more layers, and the depth of the network is more. And why do we do that? Is like we have very strong evidence recently that have been publishing since years that, let's say this is your input node. I mean, the leftmost is your input node, and the rightmost are the output nodes. There are some strong results that have been shown that deep learnings actually perform hierarchical data abstractions, which means that hierarchical data abstraction means the early layers pick up simpler features, and as we go deeper and deeper, the deeper layers actually model complex and complex features. As you can see in this illustration, the early features actually pick some random features, but the intermediate layer can group them well, and the final layer can discriminate them well. One more example I would like to give you is the famous AlexNet has been visualized and trying in the process of understanding it. The early layers of that AlexNet, which has been used for image classification, has shown that it can pick the edges of the image well, right? The edges of the image of each object in the image well. But as we go deeper and deeper, the third and fourth layers of the AlexNet for image classification, it can form some shapes or contours. Like let's say if you want to classify a dog, the fourth layer has been visualized like the contour of the dog's face or the eyes and the mouth of the dog's face, like that. So hence this is the idea behind having more and more hidden layers. The deeper layers capture higher and more abstract features. Initial layers will help you to capture finer and more simpler features. And let's combine these two things now. Let's say we have hidden layers, 3 hidden layers, and we have an input data with p dimensions. Then we have an output data with, let's say, 10 classes. We are going to classify here, and as we have discussed, every 2 layers, every 2 neurons have a weight parameter connecting them, and then the output of neuron is computed using the perceptron model that we have discussed now. I would request you to keep this handy because you will need it when we actually look at the backpropagation algorithm or subsequent things. And once the neuron is computed, the sigma wxi will have an activation function at the end of it, and it fires based on the summation, and that keeps on going until we achieve whatever we intend to learn. And so here's the thing, we have some hyperparameters here as well. It's not like we have overcome SVMs and we don't need to learn any more kernel functions. Here also we need to experiment with a lot of things. They're called hyperparameters in the machine learning terminology. First thing is, depends on your data, the input and output labels. We need to figure out how many number of hidden layers we need. That's the first thing. Second thing is like number of nodes in each hidden layer. That's still hyperparameter. And these two things we'll discuss later. Alright, so I think we are more towards end of our part one. So because I believe you will be experimenting with many machine learning problems lately. So first thing I want you to ask is like know more about the data first. If possible, try to visualize it. If not, try to visualize the characters of data. And mostly the architecture that we choose depends on the type of data. Let's say somebody has stored images which are static. I mean, each image is independent, and that is fine. We can use some CNNs. But what if somebody is dealing with a video or a sequence of images which are related? Then we can't use CNNs anymore, and we need to move to RNNs or LSTMs, right? And then there is one more thing that helps the model to learn better. These are actually some pre-processing techniques that we some usually intend to perform. First thing is scaling, right? uh, let's say you have data between 0 to 255. It's always 0 to 255, and you want to regress on that thing. It's better to scale that to 0 to 1. And some of my experiments led me to believe that scaling actually helps you to learn the model faster. The second thing is normalization. Rescaling, I mean normalization in the sense that uh, it's also called whitening of the data. You subtract the mean from your input data and you divide with standard deviation. So such kind of things are standard pre-processing techniques. And of course, if you are dealing with images, one of these things might help you. Again, based on your data, everything is based on your data. So it's better to know what we have in hand and what can we do to make it easier for our models to learn faster. And if anyone ever falls onto text processing or natural language processing techniques later on, you might want to perform one of these before you start your model training, because text is basically text, right? And you want to convert them to numbers for your mathematical model to understand it and perform learning on it. And yeah, I think we have covered this slide because we have already discussed like what is regression, what is classification, and I'm sure that most of you know what is unsupervised learning. I think Sir has taken it. It's basically we don't have the Y part here, you just have the X, and you need to find out what are patterns lies in X just using X. You don't have any Y. So clustering is one of the techniques that falls under unsupervised learning. Same as some people call anomaly detection also as unsupervised learning. Alright. So yeah, this is a slide that I was talking about. And so now how do you make your models learn? The most important question, right? So let's assume I'll go back to this slide. Okay, so this is what you have. Let's say it's simple problem. You have some sensor data, temperature, and the data that you have from a machine that is recorded, and you want to do some predictive maintenance. Let's say you want to predict when is the machine gonna fail. Maybe single dimension. Let's assume that you have a single dimension that represents some time or number of days. All right, and this is the network architecture. And how do you expect that these input data can produce the output that you are intended? Right? Initially, these neurons just perform the mathematical operation. All the numbers that are lies are in the weights, the W's. So these W's, the X are constant. I mean, they're fixed. And thing that is going to change in the process of learning is the weights, because everything is fixed. Like X is fixed. The mathematical operation that are going to be performed here is fixed. because you already fixed the activation functions. And what is that we need to change so that the sequence of this summing and non-end activations will produce the intended output. How do we change these W's? And on what basis change the W's is the question. Stop me if you don't follow me because I might be going fast a little bit here. Right. So let's initialize all weights and biases randomly. That's the key thing. We initially start off randomly. And based on the W's and X's, the final output will be produced by the network. Let's call it as a Y hat. And you already have some label for a given the data point that is Y. And how do you compute the loss of it? I mean, the loss basically represents how far are we from the intended output. Let's say you're doing a regression, then most probably you'll use this loss function, mean square error. That means we compute the difference and then we square it, right? Is mostly using regression. Let's say you have the y is less than 1, mostly less than 1. So you might also want to prefer to use mean absolute error, where you won't square it, but you'll just take an absolute value of it. So that is the one loss function that is most often when you do regression. What if you're going to do classification, right? Let me go back to this slide again. Yeah, here we are. Let's say the data is different here, okay? The output 10 classes, right? So each node indicates whether the class belongs to 0, 1, 2, 3, and we are doing, let's say, handwritten character recognition. It's one of the classic examples that we come across initially when we start off on machine learning. So we want to classify some digits which are handwritten. Okay, let's say we give the input data here, and we expect one of these output nodes to fire, and the value with the node with high value, highest value, represents that that data belongs to that class. Let's make it simple here. Y0 represents 0, Y1 represents the digit 1, and so on. Y9 represents the digit 9. Okay, so one thing that we follow in classification is to first take softmax. As we have discussed, yi is the output. If you perform softmax on the output layer, this distributes all the outputs very smoothly, and the sum of all the outputs will become 1. And that's what we would like to have when we're performing some classification. And the last function that you see here is called cross entropy. These two together combined are mostly used for classification problems. All right. So e per yi divided by summation of all I equal to 0 to n. Here n equals to 10. Or yeah, 9 represents 10 classes here. And this, so finally, when you have learned output, so one of these nodes will have, let's say, 0.8, and rest of all the nodes sums up to 0.2. Whichever node has highest value indicates that is the class that your network is predicting. All right, so you might get a question like, do we have only mean square error for regression or cross entropy classification? That's not the case, because each problem is special in its own sense, and people have come up with various loss functions which are problem specific. For example, if you look at the state of the art object detection algorithm or neural network model, somebody has proposed something called focal loss, and same thing happened for image segmentation, where somebody proposed dice loss. But again, depends on your problem. You can choose the classic loss functions, or you can come up with your own, or you can use something novel that has been appeared recently in the literature. That's up to you. But primary thing, you need to put some loss function to your model to learn it from the ideal data. So loss function is a means for the model to correct its predictions and get closer to the actual data, right? And let's say you have computed the loss function, and how do you adjust the weights so that your outputs gets closer to the ideal labels, right? That's the question. And most probably we'll be doing with gradient descent. So let's say uh, your initial output is here. You know, the 1,000 that represents in this image. I hope everyone is able to see it. And that's your loss function. And you want to have minimal loss as possible always. So you want the loss to be 0. So how do we come from here to here all the way till 0? So is there a way to it? So it's pretty straightforward. Like Nusing sir has told, gradient descent. You want to, so the name itself explains, right? Gradient and then descent. Gradient refers to the derivative, the partial derivative of loss function with respect to one of the parameters. Let's say here A represents one of the weight parameters. We have so many weights as we have seen in the MLP model, and we compute partial derivative. Partial derivative, as you know, how much of change in A brings change in F. That is the idea of partial derivative here. So N indicates the iteration, nth iteration, n plus one iteration. Let's say N is 0 here, okay. Then in A naught, which is A naught is randomly assigned, yeah. And then first we understand how much. So let's say you tweak A naught a bit, and what is the effect of that on the loss function? You observe that, and that's called delta F here. And then based on that, you change A naught to A1. And how do we change it? Let's say, so I want you to pay some attention here. Let's say the x-axis refers to A, and the y-axis refers to loss function. All right. And since you can see that this curve has a positive slope, that means with change with A raises, with A increases, the loss increases. All right. So that means, so what we do? That means if we reduce A, the loss reduces. As you already told, delta F will become positive since it's positive slope here. Hence, we want to reduce A. That's why a negative symbol here. So try to understand why we have a negative symbol here with respect to gradient. Because if A increases and loss function increases, that means if the slope is positive, we want to reduce A. We want to reduce A from its previous value in the previous iteration. So we subtract it. Let's say, let's assume that the loss function is here. That means the slope with respect of loss function with respect to weight parameter is negative. Sorry. Then we want to increase A so that the loss reduces, right? So let's say A is here and the loss is here. Since the slope is negative, we want to increase A in such a way that loss reduces. So delta F would be negative and negative of negative would be positive, and hence the next value, next iteration value of A would be higher than whatever it is now. So this is very brief summary of how gradient descent will work. And obviously we'll be doing this thing, the weight changing or weight tuning process for all the weight parameters that we have. Okay, let me go back. Yeah. So this is W1, this is W2, W3, like that, like that. So we do for all the weights present between all the hidden layers for each iteration to converge the loss function. All right. So like you were saying, the learning rate, the gamma here is the key thing. So how fast or how big a jump you want to make, that is set by gamma. Again, another hyperparameter. I request you to remember, like there are lots of hyperparameters you want to pay attention to. All right, so this sounds pretty simple and yeah, pretty convincing too. Is that as long as the loss function is just like whatever you're seeing here, but it's not always the case, right? You can actually stack up at local minima because there is no guarantee that you will end up at global minima for loss function if you follow gradient descent. There's also one more thing called saddle point. As you can see in this image, the color image here, if you compute gradient towards x direction, you'll get 0. And if you compute gradient towards y direction as well, you'll get 0. Basically, you're getting gradients in all orthonormal directions as 0, but yet it is not a local minimum. It's not local minimum or it's not global minimum, because you can see some minima exist here. So these are called some saddle points, and your gradient descent method trails here. It won't take you anywhere. So how do we, overcome this process and make our learning better, and yeah, to achieve better minima or better results? So that there's something I have backpropagation. If we have time, I'll come back to this. I mean, it's okay. I just want to provide very brief inclusion. Okay, as we have discussed here, there are too many weight parameters to update, and it can take a lot of time for doing all this. Right? Compute gradient of loss function with each weight parameter, and then modify it, and then like that. So like you have 1, 2, 3, 4 sets of weight parameters here. Imagine you have say like 10 layers or 15 layers. There are networks which do that. So training them would be really hard. It will be really hard on the computing power. A lot of time it will take. So backpropagation allows us to do it more fast, and this is one prime reasons why we are able to deep learning do so easily. The summary of it, I'll tell you just one thing. If we have time, we'll come back here. So this is what you need to focus on here. Let's say you want to compute gradients of loss function. E is the loss function here for weight parameters lying in first hidden layer. So for that, you can use weight parameters of second layer easily. So backpropagation indicates as we move back from outputs to inputs, we can reuse a lot of gradients that were computed earlier. That is the summary of it. Let me go back to this slide where we were discussing about the pitfalls of SGD. The SGD actually falls where we have saddle points or we can have local minima. Hence, we want to look at some alternatives, right? So there are numerous techniques that we proposed after gradient descent has come. One of the things is momentum, Nesterov accelerated gradient. Like there are numerous things. As a practitioner, I would recommend you to go to Adam first, because many people use Adam, and even I use Adam. Or any of these three alternatives works better, because theoretically they avoid saddle points, and of course no one can guarantee you that you'll end up at global minima, but at least these three, Adam, RMS prop, and Adagrad, can actually guarantee you that you will not stack up at saddle points. And in fact, SGD plus momentum and SGD plus NAG has proved some, some have shown some good results in terms of skipping saddle points and actually accelerating it. On the right side, you can see it's on MNIST dataset. MNIST means, like I was saying, handwritten character recognition, digits recognition. As you can see, Adam actually learns better. Like training cost, I mean the loss function here, it achieves very much less loss given the same number of iterations when compared to SGD Nestro or Adagrad or RMS Pro. Yeah, we have seen that we have a problem and we have a model architecture that we have concluded, and then we have chosen a loss function, and we have an optimization method as well to optimize the loss function that we have decided. And but I need you to pay attention for one thing here: the learning rate. gamma here. So that comes almost in all optimization algorithms. So this is the standard SGD, and the other algorithms like Adam are just slight variants of it or huge variants of it. But again, the learning rate in all these optimization algorithms do play a role. So one way of illustrating is effect of learning rate on learning is this. So if you just choose a good learning rate, that will follow a red curve. I mean, this is again an ideal illustration. I'm not guaranteeing you that the curves when you train and test your model will be as smooth as this. But the point is this: if you set the learning rate to very high, again you should ask me what is high, what is low. When people use SGD and NestRow, the learning rate is usually in terms of 1 into 10 power minus 2 or 5 into 10 power minus 3, like that. I mean, it's very low, point not 1 or point not 5, like that. But if you anyway set your learning rate high, like maybe two order of dimensions, like point 1 or say 1, you're gonna see very bad convergence. I mean, there is no guarantee that it will converge at all, like the orange line. Low learning rate, maybe like it takes a more time to converge, but yeah, it's safer option, right? And a very high learning rate, there's no chance of good convergence because it keeps on jumping here and there. So usually when if let's say again if you're going with Adam, it has some default values. Again, from experience, seems work fine, just fine. You don't need to change any default values. So if you're using Keras and stuff, you have Adam with default parameters like point not. There are two parameters in Adam, alpha and beta, and you're gonna be fine with whatever the default values that comes. Let's say if you want to tweak them on your own, then be careful of tweaking them to and setting it to a high value. If I want to convey. Okay, all right. This is an interesting slide. I want you to take note of. Let's say you started. I mean, everything's happened. You have started your training, and everything is going so smoothly. You can see the loss is converging over the epochs. For weight updating, we will not update the weight for every sample of data, and we won't update the weights for entire sample of data. So what we will do, we will take a small batch. The batch can be 32, it can be 64, 128 up to us, and it also depends on the size of the GPU that it allows. Our GPU limit would be there, memory limit. Depends on that, we will choose some batch size. And after each batch, we'll compute the loss function, we'll update the weight parameters. And like Anand has said, let's say if we have update our weight parameters using the entire training data, that's called one epoch. And we'll shuffle our data and we try to repeat it for over multiple epochs, right? So it can happen that uh, after certain epochs, you want to stop your training and see how good it is. It can be underfitting. Underfitting means it is still there is a lot more to learn from the data, and hence it could not. So I want you to look at this, figure. The dotted lines are the ideal curve, and the dots are your data points. Okay, so this is the ideal curve, and dots the data points. The straight line is what your model actually predicts. That means it is very far from actually learning. But let's say you have left it like for too long epochs. Let's say you have ran it too long, then it can happen. It actually overfits. Overfit means, though, as we are discussing from start, you want to find out patterns rather than you expect your model to learn from the data, not to rote learn, right? So it should not happen the case here. So it fits exactly to point, which is called overfitting. And we don't want to do that either because once it happens, and if your model sees some new data that it's not in its training data set, it's not going to predict, it's not going to give good predictions. Right? So the overfitting is one of the problems that we might face when we actually do real world problems. One of the things that we tackle overfitting is to have batch normalization and dropout. These are two tools that you can use while building your models. And this is very common in practice. This is called early stopping. Let's say you have training data and you have test data. That is more of a standard practice. And of course, while starting training, you will split your training into data into training and validation splits. Means, yeah, you have some validation split and you have a training split. This validation data that will not be shown to your model while training. But after every epoch that it is being trained on train set, you will see how much the validation loss is. And you want to plot it. And let's say the training and validation loss are going as expected as possible. But at this instant, the validation loss seems to increase. That means your data is being overfitted to the training data, which you don't want, because you want to your model to perform to the same degree of accuracy on unseen data as well. So what you will do is take the model at this instant and you'll be happy with it. Am I clear? Because I want you to understand this thing because we use it very often. And this is called early stopping. So you find out basically where the validation loss is going bad, and you take the saved instant of the model at this instant, the t hat, or tau hat in this case. All right. I think if you don't have any questions, this will be my last slide. This is the code for MNIST dataset. We try to do handwritten character recognition classification from 0 to 9. I'm using TensorFlow, I think 2. Yeah. So let me run the first cell. So here you can see the console output, you can see the response, and I'm using TensorFlow 2.3. Okay, and make sure you're working in somewhere in the above TensorFlow with TensorFlow 2, because using that you can actually get the data directly, or you can get the data from Keras datasets. It's up to you. I prefer Spider because it feels like MATLAB, and you can see the variables here. You can get the console output here, and of course the code here. So first, like we have discussed, right? Get the grasp of data, like how you already got the data using this single command here, and default by default it was separated as images, test images, and train images. This is a training set, right? We have 60,000 training samples, and then we have 10,000 test samples. All of them are 28 cross 28. Let's say you want to see how they looks like, then we have a way of doing it. Right. So without any image visualization, I guess that you can see that this is 5, right? You can do it yourself. If you have any issue in doing this, please let me know, or I'll move on to the next step. So I just sliced the first image from the training data, and then I try to visualize using spiders, in the variable explorer window. You can do this for second image or third image as well. This is just 0, right? So the image was captured into an ND array of size 28 cross 28. As you can see, the entire black background was marked with 0, and the actual digit was marked with some values here, non-zero values here. All right. So one thing I want you to make note is this line specifically. Why I'll tell you, because let's say if you don't, the labels is the your output labels data, right? Mostly it was written as 5041 like that. It just represents what the digit corresponds to the image. But as we have discussed, we are going to have an MLP network where the output have 10 nodes. So I want you to convert each label data into a categorical label. What do you mean by categorical label? This, let's say, yeah. So as we have seen, the first image corresponds to digit 5. So only each label will be converted into a 10-dimensional vector because our number of classes are 10, and the ID corresponds to the digit will be set to 1. The rest of things would be 0. This is what we will be doing for most of the classification problems. This is called one-hot vector encoding, one-hot encoding representation. And this line of code will help you to do that. Please let me know if you don't follow this because this is important. Almost all classification problems you'll be doing this. It's called one-hot encoding because you just have 1 in the corresponding labels of your digit. And the second image, as we have seen, it's 0. So second one have 1 at the 0th dimension. The rest of all zeros. Let's move on. What I have done in this cell is, since we have 28 cross 28, I'm just flattening the entire, we're just flattening the matrix into a vector. So that vector will have a size 784. So we are just reshaping the data into this. We have two options here. Like we have discussed, we can, since these are images, you can either go with CNNs where you will be using convolutional neural networks. If you want to do in a classical style, you don't want to do any convolutional operations, you can just stack multiple dense layers like we have seen in this architecture. Yeah, this one. So surprisingly, even this architecture will give you good enough results like 80% or 85% accuracy, but we'll go with whatever works the best. Right? So 60,000 images in training set, size 28 cross 28, and test images are 10,000 in number. Again, same dimensions, 28 cross 28. And this is where we define our model. Okay. Right. So as you can see, I have added a convolution layer, and the activation is ReLU here, and I have actually added a max pooling layer. Okay, so right, thanks. Yeah, that's the most of it. I'll explain you graphically. Let's say this is the 2 by 2 grid that we have. I want everyone to follow here because max pooling is most common operation that you will see along with convolutional networks. So let's say you have in the code you have defined it as 2 by 2, max pooling layer as 2 by 2. That means let us cover here. It's pretty straightforward, like what Ajay has said. Okay, let's say this is what the 2 by 2 layer, 2 by 2 grid of our max pooling layer comes. So we take two reasons why we perform max pooling here. First thing, we want to operate on lesser size of the features. First thing, because as we operate on larger and larger size of the images, our weight parameters will become more and more, and we can't afford the computational cost. Second thing, max pooling allows us to pick only the significant features from a local feature map. So that means, let's say this is 28 cross 28 image, right? And we want to convert it into 14 cross 14 in a single go. So half and half in each dimension. So each dimension will become half, and hence the number of features will become 4 times less. So how do we do it? It's because by replacing these 4 cells with a single cell. And how do we replace? And what is the means of replacement? Is by taking the maximum value in this 2 cross 2 grid. Same thing we will do with this 2 cross 2 grid, and we'll replace these 4 cells with a single value, and that is the maximum value. And along with max pool, we also have an option of why to replace with the maximum value can't be replaced with the average value of these 4 cells. We also have that method, but we usually won't use that. We just generally go with the max pooling concept. So I'll show it how it performs. I'll show you how it performs here. All right. So that's this thing. The flatten performs. I'll maybe it's better I show you here. Yeah, I have set Adam as the optimizer. The right side, you can see, yeah, something happened. Okay. Let me explain the model architecture using the model summary that I'll get here. Model. Here's what the model contains, right? First, you have 28 cross 28 image size. Please stop me if you don't follow it here. And 128 are the feature maps. So I'm assuming that you guys already have gone through some basic CNN, lecture. So hence 128 feature map initially, and the size is 28 cross 28. And then, as we have discussed, once we apply max pooling with 2 cross 2, 28 cross 28 images became 14 cross 14, and you also have 128 feature maps here. Hence, when you flatten it, so this will become 14 cross 14, that's 196 into 128, that is 25,088. So from here, you want to reduce the dimensions to 128. So you add a dense layer here with 128, neurons. And finally, you want to predict on your output layer, which will have 10 neurons. All right. So this is a pretty simple model where you have only one convolutional layer, then one dense layer. Strictly speaking, that's it, right? And you have a sigmoid activation function at the end, as we have discussed. And I presume that you also remember the softmax that we talked about for classification, and the categorical cross entropy, that's the loss function you specify like this. So please pay attention some here. Please pay some attention here. We define some model using Keras sequential modeling, and then you keep on adding whatever layers you want to add. What kind of activation, what kind of convolutional layer, and how many dense layers. You keep on doing it. Once you feel you're done with it, you want to compile the model.compile with what optimizer you're going to use. So the OPT is the optimizer here. They have selected as Adam with, like I told you, the default parameters and the loss function. What the loss function that you're going to use. Once you have compiled it, it's just about training the model, right? Using train images and the categorical labels and how many epochs you want to run, right? And also we have discussed in the early stopping that validation split, how much of your training data will go into validation split, and what's a batch size. Don't set this too large for 2 reasons. First thing, if you have a GPU, even your GPU might not afford to have large batch size. Second thing being, if you set batch size as too large, you might end up at very bad local minima. And smaller batch sizes help you to avoid some local minima. All right. So if I run this, just log in here. Yeah. Here you can see that the model is getting trained.